So anyway, like I said, we're going to talk about the French Revolutionary period, which goes on for almost a decade in France and part of Europe, 1789 to 99. I'll kind of get into that today because that's a major event, really, in European history that affects not just France, politically or whatever, socially, but it does affect Europe as well. I think they say the French Revolution was one of the most influential revolutions that took place in the world. I think the other one is the American Revolution, of course, which I'll kind of touch base a little bit on today. I usually don't cover as much into that, but I'll talk about it from the French perspective of the Revolution and all that. So anyway, I'm going to, of course, first talk about the French Revolution. Like I said, it took place over a 10-year period. So 1789 to 99 is the period, of course, of the French Revolution. It wasn't just a political revolution, it was social too. It changed a lot of the social fabric, of course, of France after that. It also overthrew absolutism. Remember, divine right had been pretty much the main political ideology that dominated Europe with the Bourbon regime. So they get rid of that. And then they even bring in, democratic reforms to the country as well. Of course, the other thing everybody's heard about with the French Revolution is that it kind of turned violent, which is true about that. They later had this thing called the Reign of Terror, which kind of peaks around 1792 to 93, where radicals like Maximilian Robespierre took over the country, and they executed a lot of people that were against the revolution. So you get all this period where there's kind of this terror, reign of terror that kind of comes in the country. It's kind of been sometimes compared to later the Soviet Union, like the Red Terror of Joseph Stalin, and all that. And so they do have kind of violent phases of the revolution that they go through as well. Now I'll talk about later, the end of the revolution. Of course, Napoleon will also seize power as well. So anyway, I'm going to first talk about, of course, today a little bit about who was the monarch at the time. Of course, you've got here Louis the 16th. You see there on the left, and then on the right is his wife, of course, Queen Marie Antoinette. Louis the 16th was the fifth Bourbon monarch. He was actually the grandson of Louis the 15th, who had been the king previously from 1715 to 1774. I think they mentioned him in that little short video on Marie Antoinette, how he died young. Actually, well, I think he did die young. I think it was smallpox, and then he had a son I'll get to later called the Dauphin that was supposed to be the ruler. He died of tuberculosis. Anyway, a lot of people believe that part of why the French Revolution happened was because of the fact that Louis XVI was kind of seen as inept, too young to come in and reign. He was only a teenager when he came to power in 1774. They think he had like poor leadership skills. He was indecisive. A lot of people believed he was incompetent. And so a lot of historians seem to think that kind of played a role, part of why the revolution, broke out in the beginning. I think if they had been a more decisive ruler, more competent ruler, like say maybe Louis the 14th, basically as monarch, you might not have seen the revolution go the way it was. He did have this father, like I said, named Louis the Dauphin of France, who had been the heir to the throne since the 1720s. He was the one that was supposed to be the monarch, but he died young, and so never got it. And so it went to his son, which would be the grandson of Louis the 15th. He's an interesting figure, the Dauphin of Louis. He actually had three sons that would be the kings of France, which is true. Louis the 16th, of course, the first one. And he had two younger brothers also that were Louis the 18th and Charles the 10th. That'll reign later. This will be after Napoleon's exile in the 1800s. So yeah, they do have a lot of later Bourbon rulers, but there's not too many more after that. There's really only two other rulers after that, Louis the 18th and Charles the 10th. Charles the 10th was the last Bourbon monarch, of course, of France. Of course, on the right, you could see he married Marie Antoinette, who was one of the daughters of Empress Maria Theresa, of the Austrian Empire. And she came to France at a very young age. I think her real name was Maria Antonia. And the only thing about Marie Antoinette, she was not very popular. A lot of people hated Marie Antoinette. They even called her nasty nicknames. They kind of saw her as a spendthrift and part of why France had so many problems with the country. And they called her names like Madame Deficit, I think was one nickname they called her, because when France got in a lot of debt, they blamed her for it. Because they saw her as a spendthrift, spending a lot of lavishly, things like that, fancy hairdos and fancy balls and etc. I think later when Louis XVI could veto legislation, they remarked that it was probably her that was influencing him to veto bills or whatever. So they called her Madame Veto, was another name. Also, they thought, of course, she was German, Austrian, so they called her the Austrian bitch, believe it or not. And then I think at the beginning of the reign, when they had trouble having children, they blamed her for it. They called her a lesbian, which I think the French word was la travaide, I think was what they dubbed her in French. And as you know, later, Marie Antoinette, there's a famous saying, that's attributed to her that goes back to the French Revolution, which is "let them eat cake." You probably heard of. And supposedly it was a saying that was attributed to her when French peasants were starving and didn't have enough bread. And so she simply said, "Oh, just let them eat cake instead," basically. But they don't think she really ever said it. That's one of the weird things about Marie Antoinette. And there's actually this, I think I've talked about it before, but remember Jean-Jacques Rousseau had this autobiography that he wrote that was called The Confessions of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which I think was considered one of the first popular autobiographies to come out in Europe. He actually had a quotation in there that was kind of similar to it that said, "At length I remembered the last resort of a great princess who, when told that the peasants had no bread, she replied, 'Then let them eat brioche.'" Brioche is like a type of fancy bread that has eggs in it, and raisins and things like that. I think some people put rum in it or something like that, or alcohol. And that maybe is what she's really talking about. But yeah, she was not very popular. I think also because she was foreign, like Austrian. Austria and France had been for years enemies. You know about that. So yeah, France was in crisis. The monarchy was really kind of out of touch with the average, person in France, which average person in France was a peasant that was mostly dealing with agriculture and things like that. And France was still a feudal country, like a lot of countries were in the 18th century. And it was made worse by a lot of famines and a lack of food in the country. And so that kind of helped to cause the people to want to riot later as a whole. And then the middle class didn't have any political rights and they wanted more power also as well. And you can see the Industrial Revolution was, they think, another phase. They think that may have caused it because they were behind the British. The British Empire was rising in power and becoming industrialized, and France was behind at the time. So that's Marie Antoinette. So yeah, they married very young. When they, of course, they got, and that may have been part of the problem, was that fact. Now they talk about this other issue that is very famous in the French, what they have called, they think calls the French Revolution, which is the Little Ice Age. I don't know if you have heard about this, but there's a theory that climate change, believe it or not, may have caused the French Revolution. Because I think there was a time in early modern history where there was kind of this kind of a cooling period that occurred throughout Europe and I guess part of the northern hemisphere that they had. And it caused a lot of crop failures where they had a lot of famines, like in countries like France, as an example. And so there were shortages of food, a lot of disease and things like that that were occurring. And they say that the average temperature actually dropped throughout Europe. And before that, they had this so-called medieval warm period that occurred kind of in the high of the late Middle Ages. And then there was a cooling period that occurred kind of like starting maybe around the end of the Middle Ages, early modern times. And it actually caused like colder temperatures in the year. Like they actually had deals where I think they had, if you look at pictures right here, they had cases where rivers like froze over when they never did. And I think examples of that was like in England, like the Thames River actually froze over, which is kind of a rare thing in history. And there was actually this man named Francois Mathis, who in the 1930s actually coined the term Little Ice Age. And I think he put forth different theories about it, about why this cooling period happened. But I think there's some of the main theories is that they think it had to do with volcanic eruptions that kind of occurred around that time. I know in Iceland they had that happen as an example of volcanic eruption there that may have caused it, or maybe the sun just wasn't putting out as much heat, things like that. So there's different theories on why actually the little ice age happened, but it may have caused indirectly, the French Revolution to occur. Now, one of the main things that really caused the decline, they think, of the French Empire is the 7 Years' War that breaks out. And the 7 Years' War was one of the main military, they think, conflicts that really caused the French Empire to decline in the 18th century. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that the British Empire was starting to become a major power in Europe and the world. And they lost a lot of massive defeats to them, losing most of their, North American, possessions, colonies. And they believed that it was caused by the diplomatic revolution that I talked about before, where you had the switching of the alliances, where Britain switched to be allied with Prussia, and I think also Hanover as well. So you have these German states that kind of aligned with each other in Europe. And then the Austrians aligned with the French as well. And you get other countries like Spain, which is also Bourbon, aligned with the French, and also the Russians aligned with Austria, France, and Spain as well. And although those four main ones you're looking at, they sometimes call it another nickname you may have heard of called the Stately Quadrille. That was actually the nickname of this new alliance that formed, which had to do with the so-called quadrille dance that was kind of popular in Europe at the time, where dance partners would switch all the time and things like that. And so that's how the alliance, came about with that. Now, kind of looking at this map here of different parts of the world where the 7 Years' War, of course, was fought. They think there's different theories on how the war broke out. There's like two main events that really they think sparked it. In Europe, they had Frederick the Great, who we talked about before, Kingdom of Prussia. He actually invaded Saxony, which was kind of like next to Silesia, more to the west in Germany. And he actually took it from Maria Theresa, her possessions, of course, the Habsburgs, Holy Roman Empire. And that sparked the war in Europe. And so he had a bunch of countries like France, Austria, Sweden, I think in Russia, that at one point would attack Prussia. And Prussia, fearful of being, overtaken in Europe, aligned with the British, basically, which made more sense because Britain was ruled by the Hanover dynasty. And so that's why that kind of happened anyway. The other thing that happened too was that France and Britain tangled over North American possessions, Great Lakes area, and also Eastern Canada at the time. They fought this conflict that they called in America the French and Indian War, which actually lasted the longest of the different conflicts. They called it that because both sides had, Indian allies that were in the war, and both were fighting really to control the fur trade in parts of North America, which was important to both really economies of those countries. And so, that had a lot to do with it. And that was really the thing that really caused the decline of the French Empire, is really more of the French and Indian War. You can see here one thing about the 7 Years' War that's very interesting. It is one of the first world wars that breaks out especially between the European powers. And you can see where all those lines are. Those are areas where the most of the conflict was about. Central Europe, obviously in the middle, North America, the eastern part of it, Canada, eastern part of the United States area later. And also don't forget India too. They kind of fought for control of. And they're also, I think, fighting with the Caribbean as well. But those are the main areas that they were really into. The British, what they did eventually between especially 1758 to 1760, the British launched a major campaign to try and seize Eastern Canada. The most important aspect of it was the fall of this important fortress that was called Fortress Louisbourg, which is up there close to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. That actual fortress was important because it guarded the entrance to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So any ship, going through there would get blasted by cannon. And so the British landed troops on there and seized it. That was considered really the turning point in the whole French and Indian War. And they had this general that was named James Wolfe. He was able to get forces down the St. Lawrence River. And after a siege, I think, which lasted like something like 2-3 months of Quebec, what happened was on September 13th, British forces stormed the heights of Quebec, and they defeated the French forces there. So-called Battle of the Plains of Abraham, and sometimes called, some people call it the Battle of Quebec as well. And so that they consider that battle to be really the most strategic battle, really, of the whole 7 Years' War, because the British end up seizing, Quebec and all of pretty much Eastern Canada after that. Weird thing about that battle, Wolfe died in the battle, though. And I think the general on the other side, his name was Louis Montcalm. He got killed too. So both generals got killed. It's kind of weird, but the British end up winning anyway. Now, here's kind of a map showing you right here, but basically after the Treaty of Paris, what ends up happening in 1763, the British end up with all that territory in the eastern part of North America, pretty much where the United States will be all the way to the Mississippi River, and also what is now Eastern Canada at the top. So all that goes to them. And then Spain will get the western part. Basically, the British wanted Spanish Florida to, control that eastern part of North America. And so they did a swap. And the British gave Louisiana to the Spanish. The Spanish gave Britain Florida. And so they did a swap there. And that's basically how that came about. So, yeah, there it is right there, 1763. Basically, that's the main thing. And so French get nothing out of this, of course. They lose all their North American possessions, which was really a big blow to the French Empire. I think the only thing they kept after that was really, I think they got to keep like islands in the Caribbean, like Saint Domingue or something like that, Haiti, but that was about it. So they lost India too, because after that the British start taking over India as well. Now another major thing that they think caused the French Revolution later, believe it or not, was the American Revolutionary War, American Revolution as we call it. So we call it the American War for Independence as well. So yeah, it's a major cause, which a lot of it had to do with really one of two things, I guess, that they think led to the French Revolution later. One was the French incurred a lot of debt from the war, which I'll kind of talk about later about that. But that was something they did. And the French fought Britain with backing with Americans because the fact that they wanted to get back at Britain because they had lost in the 7 Years' War. They didn't really get much out of it, though. That's the only thing about it. I think they got really a revolution because a lot of the French that fought in the American Revolutionary War were heavily influenced by it because of the fact they were fighting for, democracy, liberty, the right of self-government, and things like that. And that really helped to basically cause the French Revolution later. the French began to support George Washington, who, of course, develops the so-called Continental Army that they'll develop when the 13 colonies, break from the mother country of Britain. They think that a lot of the cause of why the American Revolution broke out was because of strong policies that were put by the Parliament on the 13 colonies, which a lot of it had to do with the debts owed from the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, and so they put heavy taxes on them. You know about this, and so later it created this patriot movement in America that caused the American Revolution to break out in 1775. Washington, who was a veteran of the French and Indian War, would later lead, if you know about this, the American forces in the war. He, of course, was from Virginia, and later, of course, the first president of the United States. The French, by about 1777, would then start aiding George Washington's forces. They're kind of important because French military support had a lot to do with why the Americans won the war. In fact, a combination of French military support, especially naval support, main thing, I think, helped to bottle up General Cornwallis's forces at the Siege of Yorktown in October 1791 in Virginia. And so that kind of played a role in why the Americans would defeat, the British, and the British would have to recognize, of course, the United States of America, which was formed in 1776. So that was definitely a major turning point, of course, with American history for later. But there are a lot of Frenchmen that went over there and fought. Of course, the most famous you see there is Marquis de Lafayette. If you know about Louisiana, we've got a lot of places named after him, like towns or whatever, Lafayette, or buildings or schools, etc. So he is like one of several Frenchmen that went over there early to back the United States. But it wasn't just him. He had also Comte de Rochambeau was another soldier that was involved as well. He was a Marshal of France that was involved in the war. Admiral de Grasse, of course, was another one who pretty much led the French Navy. And close to about 12,000 French troops helped Washington win the war. They say, I was looking it up, 22,000 naval personnel were also used. Over 60 French naval ships were involved, too, in helping to defeat the British. So they were definitely involved in why basically, the American Revolution was a success overall. So yeah, here's kind of a picture showing the Treaty of Paris, 1783, how the United States is formed. You can see pretty much it goes all the way to the Mississippi River at that point. So the British lost all that territory, of course, that we saw from the French and Indian War. Eventually, the United States is going to go all the way to, of course, to California over time. Manifest destiny. All right, now I'm going to get into today, of course, I'll get more into the French Revolution, of course, how it breaks out in 1789. There's different reasons why the revolution broke out. I'll kind of get more into today. One was the fact that French society was not equal. It was unequal. In fact, they called it a nickname. It was called the Ancient Regime. That's what people called it, which means like old regime in French. And that's what they call the political social system of France, where a lot of the upper classes controlled everything. And the upper classes had control of like the land. They had all the political power. They had all the privileges in the country. They even had control over the Catholic Church as well, the military. Most of the generals, were all from the upper class and things like that. And so you were a lower class, you really had no rights or anything as much. And going back to medieval times, the French divided the people into three social classes. They were often called the estates, or I think the other long name, if you want, is the estates of the realm. And this is something that went back to medieval times, because a long time ago, they used to say there were three kinds of people, basically: those that prayed, those that fought, and those that worked. And so the ones that are at the top were the ones that pretty much prayed and fought. and that would be the clergy, which is the first estate, and then the second estate was the nobility. So those were the two. And they didn't make up much of a population. There's a few percentage, basically, that made it up. And you can see the nobility controlled about 20% of the land, and then the rest was pretty much controlled by either the king or the church, and all that. I guess some people might own land in the lower classes, but not much, because a lot of that was a part of the feudal system that was kind of going on still in France. The third estate was made up of different peoples. They had what they call the bourgeoisie, which was the upper middle class, which in France they had a nickname for the bourgeoisie. They were called the culottes. The culottes were like this type of class, common people that were educated. Usually they were wealthy as well, as much as some of the nobility. A lot of them might be like a merchant. They might be like a doctor, a lawyer, something like that, like a Voltaire or something like that, or Montesquieu. I think we're all considered bourgeoisie. But I think actually Montesquieu was nobility, but Voltaire definitely was bourgeoisie. But I think Karl Marx later said that the bourgeoisie were the ones that became the capitalists later, the so-called townspeople that over time will eventually control the economy, etc. And they called them culottes because they wore these types of they call them like type of pants called breeches, which come down to like your where your knee is, and it was usually a mark of upper class status. And a lot of the people would also wear like powdered wigs and things like that, and the bourgeoisie would dress like the nobility. Urban lower class were the townspeople. They were like a skilled type labor, so they might own a business. They might be like a butcher, a blacksmith, a tanner, something like that, where they made a living, had some kind of skill. And they're considered like a lower middle class. And they were often nicknamed in the French Revolution the sans-culottes because they didn't wear the breeches or culottes. They wore just traditional pants like people wear today. And then on the bottom, you see you've got the peasants, of course, which make up most people in France at the time. I think the French population may have been 30, 40 million range. What did they want? The peasants just wanted to eat, like, or have food available that was, cheap, that kind of thing, like bread, mostly I know, was the main diet of most people, most peasants. Lower taxes. They also wanted to get rid of feudalism or feudal ties that were, still there, in early modern times. And so they're the reasons why the revolution kind of turns violent too, as well. But really, those two in the third estate, the bourgeoisie and the urban lower classes, they're the ones that really would want more rights more than anything, because they're kind of like the middle class. Now, talk about the early stages of the revolution, which began. I'll kind of talk about Abbé Sieyès in a second, but they say the reason why the revolution broke out was because of the fact that France had all this debt they had to pay from the American Revolution. And of course, the country was on verge of bankruptcy at that point. And not many people knew about it, by the way, I think until about 1788, that the government had kind of been secretive about how much money they owed. And the amount of money they owed, by the way, if you want to know how much it was in American dollars, it was actually about not quite $1 billion was how much they owed at the time. 1.3 livre, which a livre was at the time a kind of what they call the French pound. It looked like a British pound, I guess they had in England. But yeah, they owed like maybe what is now in American dollars about $850 million that they owed. And so the king, which we talked about before, Louis XVI, was forced to call what they call the Estates General, which I'll be talking about in a second. I'll get to the National Assembly in a second about that. But the Estates General was this medieval representative assembly, which had been around since like it went back to the late Middle Ages, and it represented the three social classes, the estates, of course, of France, and it really didn't have any authority to actually pass laws or taxation like, say, the British Parliament did. It was more like an advisory body to the monarch, and it actually had been shut down in 1614 because of divine right, absolutism, and so it hadn't really met in something like 100-something years. So it'd been a while. And so what happened was the king called for this parliament to meet, which met, by the way, at Versailles in the spring of 1789. And about 1,200 delegates were elected to this parliament, basically, which represented all three estates. And I think about half of them were from the third estate, and then the other half were about first and second estates. And what caused the actual French Revolution to break out politically was the fact that the assembly, they couldn't figure out how they were going to vote, as representatives, basically. And I think the king wanted them to vote by estate. But the third estate was like, we ought to vote by representatives because I think we have a lot of people. And so that was one of the loggerheads that actually caused the whole revolution to break out, was because they couldn't figure out how to actually vote. What caused the thing to really blow up more was that in 1789, like maybe on February, I think it was, this man named Abbé Sieyès, who was a Catholic priest in Abbott, published this pamphlet that was called "What is the Third Estate?" which became very, very popular, and a lot of people saw it as like a manifesto of the revolution, of which it would be. It's kind of like the Thomas Paine, maybe, of the American Revolution. He wrote Common Sense, remember that? So he's kind of comparable to that a little bit. But he asked a bunch of questions at the beginning of it, which were very interesting. He said, what is the third estate? He said everything. And because he said that because of the fact that France was the majority of the third estate, like 90-something %, basically. What has it been heretofore in political order? What has it been up to politically? Nothing, because they don't have any rights. Third question was, what does it demand? To become something. So he wants the third estate to politically be significant and have political rights and things like that. And Sieyès he didn't just do that. He went further. Sieyès, he attacked the upper classes as being, having too many rights, too much power, too much privilege. And he believed that the third estate ought to create its own legislative body, assembly, that would represent all the French people, especially the third estate. And so that's really what led to eventually politically the revolution, really beginning at that point. And so it led to the formation in June of 1789, the National Assembly, which the actual full name is actually the National Constituent Assembly. That's what the French called it, although they kind of shortened it later to National Assembly. It's kind of too long of a name, I think. Anyway, they think it's the thing that really effectively, begins the revolution. And they would first meet on June 17th, 1789, where all the delegates would come. They asked like anybody that was in the first or second estate could join. So like in the first estate, Abbé Sieyès joined it. Second estate, Marquis de Lafayette, who was kind of involved early in the revolution, also joined it as well. So it wasn't just the third estate that was involved. He had some nobility that backed it, and clergy and things like that, to, I guess, demand change at that point. What happened? The king, Louis XVI, tried to lock them out of their meeting room at Versailles. And so they went to this nearby tennis court, I think it's a squash court, I think they call it at the time. It was like racquetball, really more. They meet in this tennis court, and on June 20th, 1789, they all take an oath, basically, to, they said they would basically form a constitution for France, which, France didn't have at that time. And it would take them like a couple years to write a constitution, but that was their main oath that they would take. This painting, by the way, is very famous. It was done later by Jacques-Louis David, who did a lot of paintings of the French Revolution, age of Napoleon, kind of romanticizes it, a lot. That's actually Abbé Sieyès in white there, taking the oath. You can see kind of in the middle on the left. He's kind of involved in it. And they say he's one of the main figures that's kind of behind the beginning of the revolution. Here's the actual oath. About 578 delegates actually signed it and took the oath. The National Assembly, considering that it has been summoned to establish the Constitution of the Kingdom, decrees that all members of this assembly shall immediately take a solemn oath not to separate until the Constitution of the Kingdom is established on firm foundations, which they didn't have one anyway. The king was the Constitution before. And so they were promising to, like I said, create a constitution. Now, what would happen next? That's the political beginning of the revolution. Now, there was fear that the king would shut the revolution down, like these reforms that they're starting to do at that time overall. And so what happened was with the formation of the National Assembly going on, the thing turned violent. If you know about that, the revolution in July of 1789. And they would storm this thing called the Bastille on July 14, 1789. What was the Bastille? The Bastille was a French political prison and armory that was basically a symbol of the Bourbon regime, which was in Paris. It had, by the way, held a lot of political prisoners in there, including Voltaire. Voltaire had been in prison in the Bastille at one point. And so it was a major symbol of tyranny, a major symbol of absolutism, things like that. And so the people stormed it. If you know about the storming of the Bastille, there were actually about, I forget the number of guards that were involved. I think it was like 114 soldiers were actually guarding it. Anyway, there was a nobleman named Marquis de Launay. He was actually one of the first to be killed in the revolution. They killed him and then they cut his head off and put it on a pike. And then part of why they stormed it was because of the fact that it had a lot of weapons in it, gunpowder and rifles and cannon they could use against the regime. And after they stormed it, the French people later tore it down, like stone by stone, all that. And so it's not there anymore in Paris. They tore it down. And so, yeah, the storming of the Bastille, that's considered to be a cornerstone, of course, French nationalism, of course, later. Part of they say why it happened was because Louis XVI had this finance minister that was named Jacques Necker, who was, I think, Swiss French. And he was the only one, I think, in the cabinet of Louis XVI's government that favored some kind of tax reform, where they might tax the upper classes instead of the lower classes, which they were doing. So I guess it was fear that was going to happen. And I think there was a rumor that he got fired because of Marie Antoinette, basically. And so that's why they stormed it. It was because of that. And I think they had to put him back in, but after that, it was just too late, basically. So yeah, here's images. They've done a lot of paintings, of course, of the storming of the Bastille, but basically citizens, even soldiers, switched sides to back the revolution in France at that point. And there was a case where I think they came to the king and he asked it, is it a revolt or something like that, was the comment that Louis XVI said. And no, sire, it's a revolution, was the reply. So the revolution breaks out at that point. The French later have this celebration that they, of course, create out of it in later modern times, which became a holiday in 1880, which was created by this French politician named Benjamin Raspail. And of course, that was the so-called birth of Bastille Day, which is kind of like a national day of France, where they kind of celebrate, French unity and all that. It's kind of comparable to our 4th of July, where they have parades and fireworks and things like that. And they parade down the Champs-Élysées, of course, in Paris, the capital. like military parades and things like that. And I think even sometimes the United States will even have like some troops parade with it, things like that. And so that's a big thing, in France that they have. So yeah, it's comparable to sometimes the 4th of July celebration we have for our country, for American independence. All right, I'm going to talk about next some of the stages of the revolution, because the revolution kind of goes through, kind of starts out moderately, doing like reforms of the state, and then over time it gets kind of radical and crazy. I'll kind of get into that. And they have what they call the Great Fear that occurs like around about the summer, fall is about when it breaks out. And what the Great Fear was a rebellion where all the people kind of got involved in it. And you had a deal where even the peasants get involved. The peasants actually will attack the nobility throughout the country. People get rioting because there's not enough food throughout the country. There's even this case where women march on Versailles. So you have this whole thing, and it's like a mass hysteria throughout the country. And you have even deals where the peasants formed these mobs of peasants. I think they called them brigands, and they went around attacking nobility and their land and stuff like that. Now, I think it even forces some Frenchmen to flee the country as immigrants. They actually leave the country and all that. Now I've got like a kind of a map showing it right here, but you can see how it spreads throughout the country. So it first started in Paris and Versailles, and the next thing you know, it's all over the place. I think July, August was the peak of it, of the Great Fear and all that. And it got so bad that what happened was the Women's March occurred by the early fall in October, and you had cases where the French stormed the Palace of Versailles too as well. They broke into it and they basically seized the Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette, and they forced them to live in Paris. So they were forced to abandon, reigning from Versailles, which they had done since Louis XIV's reign and all that. And I think they mentioned it how they would be put in what is called the Tuileries Palace. Yeah, the Tuileries Palace, which is a palace which is part of was used to be part of the Louvre, but it burned down. What would happen after that? Then the National Assembly would start making all these reforms to the country, which at first they were kind of like moderate type reforms that were created in the country. They actually came out with this thing called the August Decrees. What was that? These were a bunch of decrees by the National Assembly, which ended a bunch of things in the country, like all the rights and privileges of the nobility was gotten rid of. So there would be no longer separate social classes. Everybody would be what they call a citizen, is the term they started using. It's kind of close like comrade, I guess they used later, like the communists had later. Serfdom was abolished. They abolished feudalism as well. They didn't. A lot of the peasants, lower classes, didn't have to pay church tithes to the Catholic Church. So all those were things that were made overnight in France in August of 1789. Also, August 26, the Assembly adopted what is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. What that did was it gave all male citizens equal rights, which did not include women, by the way, which kind of a sad thing at the time, but most women wouldn't really get any rights equally till almost the 20th century, be a little later when that is. And the actual Declaration of the Rights of Man was drafted by several men. They think Abbé Sieyès and Marquis de Lafayette were the main ones that were mostly behind it. And they say that they believe that Thomas Jefferson, who at the time was a diplomat in Paris when the revolution broke out, they think he may have helped consult them in the writing of it. And so they think his Declaration of Independence, which he wrote in 1776, was kind of influential on it. But they think it was also influenced by like Voltaire, Rousseau, and likely the English Bill of Rights. So those are kind of some of the things that kind of influenced it more or less overall. Also, the French began to adopt a slogan during the Revolution, which became famous. It was liberty, equality, fraternity, which fraternity has to do with the brotherhood of mankind, or men, and that thing, men being equal, things like that. And of course, one of the most famous things they started to use in the French Revolution is the so-called French tricolor, their national flag, which you see right here, which is blue, white, and red. And so that becomes traditionally the main flag over time that France will adopt, and they replace that. I think previously they had some kind of Bourbon flag that was used by the French monarchy. That became the traditional flag that they, of course, will use from there on out. I think Napoleon starts using it a lot too when he takes over France and Europe as well. Now, the other thing, I'll get to the Jacobins in a second, but I want to talk about some of the different, reforms that were made in the country at this point. One of the main things that happened after they declared the Declaration of Rights of Man and all these reforms, they did eventually adopt an actual constitution, which took them a while to do that, almost like 2 years to hammer it out. And it formed a constitutional monarchy. That's what the French decided that they would keep, with Louis XVI as like a figurehead. And it would have a unicameral assembly, which they called it at that point. It was called the Legislative Assembly, which would be around for about 1 year. And under this assembly, the Legislative Assembly would control all the laws, the taxation, things like that. And the king had limited powers. He was a limited monarchy, but he did have one thing that was true that he had power-wise. He had what they call a suspension veto, where he could sometimes veto like bills or laws. And that kind of just made it worse for him because when he would veto something that was against the revolution, it would make him look bad. And so people thought he was a traitor and that kind of thing. Then they also accused his wife of being behind it, and so they called her Baton veto. If you remember about that. What made it worse was that Louis XVI, then in June of 1791, decided to flee the country. Yeah, he and his family. It was called the Flight to Varennes. They sometimes nickname it in the French Revolution. And so in June of 1791, they left. They tried to leave the country in disguise. I think Louis and his wife dressed as servants. The servants dressed as them, that kind of thing. But they were caught halfway to the border with the Netherlands, Austria and Netherlands, which is where Luxembourg and Belgium would be. And they were caught, and after that, they were seen as traitors to the revolution. And so after that, the whole monarchy went downhill. And so people start talking about putting in, at that point, a republic. And part of what leads to it is the Legislative Assembly. They had different political groups that were in it, but the most notorious that rose to power was the so-called Jacobins, that you may have heard about. The Jacobins were kind of a left-wing or radical type political party that kind of emerged during the French Revolution, although it was really more like a political club than an actual political party that we think of, say, in Britain or the United States. And it was actually not one party. It was actually made up of different factions, which I'll give you the two main ones that were in it. The two main ones was, you had one side that was called the Girondists, which were more moderate. And then you had the Montagnards, which were called the mountain men, were more radical, more to the left of them. And many of them, like the Montagnards, favored eliminating the monarchy and putting in a republic. And I'll get more into it later, but one of their founders of the Jacobins was Maximilien Robespierre, who you see at the top right there. He was a French lawyer and later dictator of France. And over time, they're going to take over the country, Maximilian, and they'll create the so-called Reign of Terror, which is more of the radical phase of the revolution. And actually, they weren't called Jacobins originally. They were called the Society of the Friends of the Constitution, because they formed originally because they backed the idea of a France having a constitution, going back to 1789, and they got the name Jacobins because they met at this monastery in Paris that had that name, and so the name stuck, being used later. They did have a motto, which was "Live free or die." So that kind of summed up their movement and all that. Another thing about the Legislative Assembly I did want to talk about, which is kind of famous if you study about the French Revolution, the whole left-right political spectrum. You hear like left versus right and that kind of thing. It actually starts in this assembly that they have, because what ends up happening is the people that are more liberal or more radical sit on the left, and then the ones that are more moderate sit in the center, and then the ones that are more conservative sit on the right. And so that's where that came from, that whole left-right spectrum that you have. And so the Montagnards were more way to the left side. And they were sometimes called the Mountain because they sat high up on the left. And that's where the name comes from, the Mountain, or Mountain Men also as well. Before the Jacobins really seized control of the state, though, totally, they have the Tuileries Palace is actually stormed in August of 1792. And the French decide to get rid of the monarchy at that point. And so France, in the fall of 1792, declares a republic. And so so-called First French Republic forms at that point. And they later have a new parliament they create again. That's called the National Convention, which will control the country for about 3 years, from 1792 to 95. But really, I'll get to it later. Robespierre is the one that really takes it over and becomes like a dictatorship. They have this thing called the Committee of Public Safety that controls the whole country more than anything. But yeah, I'll get more into it. But the revolution's going to really turn violent, in France. The formation of the French Republic, it sparks a bunch of wars throughout Europe, which are known as the French Revolutionary Wars, which will go on for about 10 years until Napoleon takes it over and becomes the Napoleonic Wars that you have later. But you get all these countries in Europe like Austria, Prussia, Britain, Russia, Spain. They all declare war on France because they're fearful that this French Revolution is going to overthrow their monarchies. And so that's why that occurs, of course, with the French. And I think for a while at first it looked like the revolution was going to get shut down because Prussia decided that they were going to invade and try to, help, I guess, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette with the Austrians. Austrians like backing them and all that. But they were actually beaten at the Battle of Valmy in September of 1792. And so they were unable to really save them, the royal family, and they later end up getting executed via the guillotine, of course, you're looking at. That's one of the things I wanted to talk about that's real famous, about the French Revolution is the guillotine. The guillotine really becomes the most famous symbol of the whole, not just the French Revolution, but the Reign of Terror. The guillotine was a type of invention that was actually created to make execution more humane, which before that, when you were executed, they would have all kinds of methods. Like if you were lower classes, it might be hanging, it might be drawn and quartered, things like that. It might be ways, burned at the stake. Nobility were usually decapitated, like with an axe usually, maybe a sword at the worst. But there are just different methods that really were just not equal among the French and all that. And apparently there was a physician that was under Louis XVI. His name was Antoine Louis. He was the actual man that would invent it. He invented the actual guillotine or guillotine, as it's called also. Kind of ironic, later in the revolution, during the Reign of Terror, he would actually be executed by his own invention. That's kind of the funny thing about that. That'll be later. But So they think it was invented around maybe or completed about 1792. The actual guillotine. It was first used on prisoners in that year, and part of why it's called guillotine was because it was named after this other doctor named Dr. Joseph Guillotine, and he was a big supporter of it. He was a delegate to the assembly, and so he thought it should be used, in France as the main form of execution. And so that became basically what they used for everybody. So everybody would get the same execution, no matter who they are, wealthy or poor, that kind of thing. They even tried to nickname it different things like Lucette, Lusitine, Luzon. I think were all nicknames where they tried to name it after the inventor, Dr. Antoine Louis, but they thought it was too close to the king's name, like Louis the 16th. A lot of people called it as a nickname, the National Razor. And so that was kind of a name that everybody called it. And it's crazy. They used it up to 1977. Kind of joke about it sometimes, but that was the same year Star Wars came out, the original movie. So they were still using it for almost 200 years. Crazy. The Germans had something similar to it. It was called the fall. I think it was called the fall bell, falling axe, or something like that. They think it was influenced from German designs. Those are statistics on the guillotine. You can see it was very heavy, almost weighing 1,300 pounds. The average blade was almost 90 pounds. Wow! So imagine that coming down on the back of your neck. The height of the side posts were about 14 feet tall. The blade drop was almost 90 inches from top to bottom. It fell at a rate of about 21 feet per second, or 1/70th a second, they believe. It only took about 200th of a second for your head to be cut off. That's how fast it was. If you blinked or you looked away, you would miss it. The guy getting his head cut off. Power and impact was about 888 pounds per square inch. Wow. And of course, a lot of people immediately will lose consciousness and die. But if you know about it, when people would get their head cut off, they would still have reflexes where they'd move their hands or arms. And I think they say their eyes would keep blinking afterwards as well after you got your head cut off. Now, there are famous people that were killed by it, by the way. I'll kind of mention about. These three were the most famous that were executed via guillotine. Louis the 16th, of course, was executed on January 21st, 1793. Marie Antoinette, October 16th, 1793. Of course, they talked about that in a little short video. Maximilian Robespierre was also executed too, on July 28th of 1794 as well. So those are some of the famous ones that were executed via guillotine. I'll kind of talk briefly about Jean-Paul Marat. You may have heard of him. He was a big martyr of the French Revolution. He was actually killed on July 13th, 1793. He was actually murdered, and he was actually sitting in his bathtub taking a bath because he had this horrible skin illness that he had, and where he had to take baths all the time. And he was actually killed by this woman named Charlotte Corday, who was more of a Girondist supporter. I think Marat was more supportive of the Montagnards and Robespierre, who was more radical. And he had this newspaper that was called the Friend of the People, which really supported the whole Jacobin causes and all that. And Marat was really a bloodthirsty editor of this paper. He would often put quotations in it like, in order to ensure public tranquility, 200,000 heads must be cut off. And so just that kind of stuff being put in papers. And his death was later, they made a famous painting of it by Jean-Jacques Louis David, The Death of Marat, probably one of the most famous paintings ever done of the French Revolution. And Corday was later found guilty of it, killing Marat, and she was also sent to the guillotine also as well. But Marat became like this big, martyr of the whole cause, and that's part of why Marie Antoinette was eventually executed. She was kind of blamed for it. She was put on trial, and then later it led to her execution in October 1793. And there's a famous story about when she went to get executed. She supposedly accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot, when that, I guess, pulls down the guillotine. She said something like, "I didn't mean to step on your foot." Basically, I didn't do it on purpose, or something like that. That's what she said. So, kind of a tragic story about her, of course, being executed. Then what happened was the I was talking about how what happened. The Jacobins then took over the country. If you know about that, between 1793 to 94, starting like the so-called Reign of Terror, where they went after people that were against the revolution. And Robespierre formed a dictatorship that was called the Committee of Public Safety. And it was this 12-man committee that basically had control over the country. They kind of suspended the Constitution for a while as well. And they tried to root out enemies of the state. And so they think that anywhere from like 40,000 or more people in France were actually killed by the Jacobins. They were either executed via guillotine, some were even just killed in prison like that as well. And it was kind of this counter-revolutionary movement to try to prevent the revolution from being overthrown internally. And so that's why the guillotine, starts to be used a lot throughout the country. And one of the things he did that's very, very famous was the Jacobins started doing a lot of radical reforms of the country, which were later joked as being called the so-called Republic of Virtue, from a speech that Robespierre gave one time in the National Convention Assembly. And they created all these radical reforms, including getting rid of Christianity. They actually abolished it in France at this point. And for about 10 years, they had this cult they created, which was based off of deism, the so-called deist cult, which was called the cult of the supreme being or something like that. And they had this festival they had every summer, like June 8th, 1794. And so they tried to stake a state religion that was based off of deism instead of Catholicism. And the Jacobins went crazy. They literally just anything that had to do with, the monarchy, the nobility, they got rid of it. So statues of kings, they tried to remove that or cut the heads off statues, things like that. So you didn't want to say anything about having a monarchy or nobility, and you'd be probably killed. Basically, it's kind of true, but they actually like face cards, like playing card decks. They got rid of the face cards. They don't want anybody to know there's a king and a queen and things like that. And so that was just things like that they were doing. And then probably the most radical thing they did in the revolution was they created this thing called the French Republican calendar, or some people call it the French Revolutionary calendar. And it was an anti-Christian calendar, is what it is, where they were trying to eliminate anything to do with religion, the Catholic faith. And so basically what they did was they started from scratch, from what they call year one. In fact, they didn't want anybody to know like where all the holidays were, Christmas, Easter, any kind of saints holidays, that would be eliminated as well. And they made the calendar more based off of things like reason, science, in the age of enlightenment, etc. The calendar was strange. It started from year one, if you know about this. So year one became 1793. Year two in this, 1794. Year three, so on down like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, basically. And they would use the calendar for about over 10 years, up to like the time of Napoleon, who later got rid of it, basically. The calendar was strange. It had like still 12 months, but they actually had 10 days a week instead of 7. So you would have 3 weeks in a month, basically, instead of 4 usually. And then on top of that, they changed all the names of the months and the days and things like that. You can see like Vendemiaire was like an example of when September, October is. usually between months is when it actually is. You can see there, Vendemiaire, Brumaire, Frimaire, Nevos, Pluvos, Ventos, Germinal, Floreal, Prairial, Messidor, Thermidor, Fructidor. So all these are based off of the seasons, basically, is what it is. So Brumaire, fog month, basically, because I guess in October, November, it's foggy in parts of France and things like that. Or Thermidor, it's really hot, like around July. So hot month or heat month, basically. So it's all mostly based off of like the seasons and things like that. And the British made fun of it, if you know about this. And the British said that wheezy, sneezy, and freezy, that was, I guess, what they call fall. Slippy, drippy, and nippy was winter. Showery, flowery, and bowery was spring. And then summer was hoppy, croppy, and poppy. So they later made fun of it. And it was kind of a ridiculous calendar. But if you know about Cambodia, they tried that too. The Cambodian Khmer Rouge revolution in the 20th century, where they, year one, you know about that, they did kind of the same thing as well. Eventually what happened was the Jacobins, like the radical ones, like the Montagnards, they eventually got overthrown. And what they call it different names, but sometimes called the Thermidorian reaction, I think is what they sometimes called it, or revolution. And so moderates took over the country, and they instigated this thing called the White Terror around 1794-95, where they went after anybody that had been a supporter of like Robespierre and his radicals. And you could be put in jail or executed too. Robespierre was guillotined himself, as you know. And I think Napoleon, who I think at one point backed some of the Jacobins, was in prison for a while because of that, but they didn't end up killing him. What ends up happening is they put in a new government. There's Robespierre, of course, his execution right there via guillotine, the incorruptible. But eventually they put in a new government, eventually by 1794-95, which was called the French Directory. And this was a government that they put in that was kind of a moderate government that kind of concludes the French Revolution. And later, you're going to see the rise of Napoleon in it. You'll kind of become one of its best generals. That's under it during the French Wars of the French Revolutionary Wars at the time. And the reason why it was called the Directory is because it had these 5 executive directors that ran the executive branch of it. You see on the left there, one of the most famous figures of it was Paul Barras. He's going to be one of the directors that's pretty important. That really helps to give Napoleon a chance. You'll make Napoleon one of his top generals under him, and part of why Napoleon is able to eventually seize control of France. But it had a legislature, which I don't think it had an official name, but it had like this bicameral legislature, which had 2 houses. There was one house that was called the Council of 500, which proposed a lot of the laws of the country. And then it had the Council of Ancients, which had about 250 members, which would actually vote on the laws. And anyway, the Council of 500 was important because it also picked the directors, who the actual executive rulers would be of the country. But you could see Paul Barras, he was the one that really, is the one that had the real power later. But what happens eventually, because of the fact that Napoleon Bonaparte becomes so successful militarily in the French Revolutionary Wars, you're going to see he's eventually going to take power. That's the thing that's going to really happen. I'll get to it later, but Napoleon is going to seize control of the country in 1799 in a coup d'etat. And you'll see the age of Napoleon. It'll kind of emerge, of course, after that. And by the way, Napoleon was a Corsican. He was from Italy, basically. He'll, of course, become the main leader of the country. So we'll talk about that next week coming up about who Napoleon is and what he does, of course, to France, because he kind of helps to end the revolution in 1799. And and then he'll dominate France and Europe up to about 1814, 1815. So anyway, before I go, I did want to talk about announcements, like I said, for the week. I think y'all have got two main announcements I know right now that are out. Overall, the British quiz, of course, I gave you the other day. That'll be due next week. And then the second vocab, that's due starting Friday into next week. So you can go ahead and start posting that in Canvas for me to grade that assignment. I think that's our main assignments. I think we have a discussion thing going on still about the rise of the British Empire. If you want to participate with that in discussions, that's still there for bonus points. You want to do that as well. But I think that's it for today. I think Sierra had come in earlier, by the way. Good morning. But anyway, that's it pretty much for the week. If you have any comments, questions, I don't think we have any comments, questions I know today. Looks like it. But if you have any comments, questions, you can always, of course, leave me questions on my YouTube channel, or also you can also email me if you got a question about the class. So that's it for the week. Y'all take care. Have a great weekend, of course, coming up. And of course, next week I'll kind of, like I said, continue talking about Napoleon. Okay. So y'all take care and have a good one.